So thank you for turning out. It's amazing to me how many people will turn out for free coffee. This is really impressive, you know. My name is Andy Alexander. I'm a Bobcat. I went to school here. I am best known as the editor of the OU Post the year the school closed because of riots. It had nothing to do with that, but for you young people, you have to Google it. Exciting time. You think you know how to demonstrate. You don't. You know nothing about it. We knew how to demonstrate, you know. I was asked to tell you a little bit about me. So I graduated from Ohio University with a degree in journalism. I see a few people in my class here that I teach. They know I'm all about journalism. It's all I ever wanted to do. I don't know anything else. I don't know anything about science. If you came here for science, you need to go to a different part of Baker Center. I know nothing about that. I know journalism. That's all I know. And after I graduated from Ohio University, I started my career in Dayton, Ohio, and then I was with a newspaper there, part of the Cox newspapers chain. And I was then, after a couple of years, sent to Washington, and I've been a Washington journalist ever since then, since 1976. Long career covering everything from local politics to Congress to a little bit of White House coverage, a little bit of presidential campaign coverage. And then I got sucked into foreign reporting, so I've reported from about 50 countries. And then I got sucked into management and got elevated within Cox. So eventually I ran the Cox Newspapers Washington Bureau for many years. Cox Newspapers was a chain of about 20 papers. The largest would be the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, papers in Arizona, Florida, Texas, Ohio, Colorado. And basically being a bureau chief, what you do is I ran a staff of about 35 or 40 people in Washington, managed foreign bureaus in Moscow, London, Beijing, Mexico City, Jerusalem, Baghdad, a couple other places. And then late in my career, I was recruited by the Washington Post to do a job called the Ombudsman. That's a funny name, it's a Swedish origin, but basically it is a job where you are independent in the news organization, but you are taking the complaints of readers about the publication and investigating them. So I could talk for hours about this. I will just cut to the chase and say it's a job where absolutely everybody hates you. And they tell you that. I mean, the people who you're trying to serve don't like you. The people in the newsroom don't like you because you're writing critically about them. But it's a great job because it teaches you so much about journalism, and from both sides. You really hear it from everyone. So with that background, after that, I started getting hooked into being hired to do different things for Ohio University, and as often happens with Athens, you just start to like it, and before you know it, you're here. You don't know how you got here, all that. So I live in Washington. I come here on a regular basis. I teach an ethics course. I'm also an executive in residence at the Voinovich School and do some work for them. So for tonight's topic, which is about President Trump and the battle for a free press, probably the most important thing you need to know about me before I start talking about this is that I am not like a talking head ideologue. I am a proud member of the mainstream press. I am really proud of that. I am proud of the fact that I have been a registered independent my entire life. I am proud of the fact that I try very hard not to express any opinions so that people don't have any idea what I really think. The truth is sometimes I don't even know what I think, so it wouldn't be good to try to be expressing opinions. But I'm giving you that sort of front-end disclaimer because if you're expecting to interpret this as a big rant against Donald Trump because he's a Republican, whatever the hell he is, and I'm a Democrat, that's not what this is all about. I am a journalist. I am somebody who has observed Washington journalism for a long time. I am very fallible. I make lots of mistakes in my judgments, but I think I know a lot about this. And what I tell students right now is that this period we are going through, because students, because of their age, they have no real context of knowing what this is all about. But this is not normal. And there is a lot at stake here, what's going on with this battle between the president and the press. You've all heard his descriptions of the press. I've written some of them down here. We are among the most dishonest human beings on earth. We are scum. We are the lowest form of life. That's pretty low. We are enemies of the American people. It only took like 2 hours before T-shirts started being sold on industry sites, enemy of the people. We are corrupt, and we produce nothing but fake news, all right? So that's pretty harsh, but it is important as we begin this discussion to sort of put that in context. It's never been good between presidents and the press, and there have been times that it's a lot tougher. If you go back to 1798, John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Act, which basically made it a crime to criticize a government official. 1805, Thomas Jefferson, there is a quote from him that people in the media like to really promote because it supports their view that he really understood the free press. And you've heard this before. He said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." So that's pretty good stuff when we're going up against Trump and people who are trying to attack the media. What is less quoted is 2 years later, after he'd had his fill of the press, when he wrote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle." So he had his own complaints. Abraham Lincoln, arguably our greatest president, got angered by a story at the height of the Civil War. Some New York newspapers reported that he was going to conscript 400,000 young men. Turned out not to be true. He was so angry, he threw them in jail. On his orders, he threw them in jail. Franklin Roosevelt, always seen as having pretty good relations with the press, was so angered at a press conference once at a reporter who was asking tough questions that he publicly humiliated him, shamed him, and told him he needed to don a dunce cap and go over and stand in the corner. And he didn't just leave it at that. He kept on him. He said, "No, I want you to go over and stand in the corner," all right? So imagine Donald Trump doing that. There was another press conference, 1942. FDR was angered by a New York Daily News reporter who kept asking very critical questions about how the war was going. And FDR pulled out a Nazi Iron Cross and handed it to the reporter and said, "Here, you deserve this." What he was really saying is, "You're aiding the enemy. That's what I think of you," all right? Fast forward, Richard Nixon. We all know about his enemies list. He was also an incredible anti-Semite who was suspicious of Jewish reporters. We know from the Nixon White House tapes that he was angry at the Sulzberger family, which then and now controls the New York Times, Jewish family. Nixon had his henchman, Vice President Agnew, who went around the country and got crowds every bit as large as Donald Trump gets, simply to speak and attack the press. And he had great speechwriters. One of his famous lines, some of these old people here, they're going to come up with this, they can repeat it. "And effete corps of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals, and then nattering nabobs of negatism," which is a great line, which ironically was written by a speechwriter, William Safire, who later went to the New York Times as a conservative columnist, very controversial, turned out to be a tremendous columnist who was often critical of Nixon after he left and won the Pulitzer Prize. The Agnew thing worked for a while until he was indicted for taking $100,000 in bribes and tax fraud and had to resign in disgrace. So that sort of ended that, all right? But the point is that it's nothing new for presidents to attack the press. It is also nothing new for presidents to tell the big lie. You go back to the Cold War, Soviet Union shoots down a jet. They said it's a spy plane. Our president, Dwight Eisenhower, publicly said, "That's crazy, that's not our plane." Soviets said it's an American plane. Eisenhower kept saying it's not our plane. He kept saying that until the Soviets trotted out the actual pilot, an American, Francis Gary Powers, who had been shot down and actually managed to survive by parachute. So a big lie there. Lyndon Johnson, those of you who remember the Vietnam War, one of the early pretexts for going to war in Vietnam was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where we said that basically one of our ships was in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam, and North Vietnamese gunboats fired on us, and then there was allegedly a separate incident a couple days later. We now know from classified documents that was not true. And if there's any truth to it, we were the ones who fired on them first, and the second incident is completely made up by our government to promote it. That's a pretty big lie with big consequences. When you think about the Vietnam War, 58,000 Americans died, 153,000 were wounded, 1.3 million civilians or enemy combatants were killed. That's a pretty big price to pay. Other big lies, you can look at Ronald Reagan, his claim that he was there when we liberated Nazi concentration camps. Ronald Reagan never spent a day out of California during the entire Second World War where he was making training films. But somehow he saw these films and thought he must have been there when they did this. Or this quote you may recall, "I have not had sexual relations with that woman," all right? All right, Bill Clinton, 1998, he was impeached for lying under oath on precisely that topic, and by the skin of his teeth escaped being convicted in the Senate. Another Clinton quote, this one from Hillary, where she said that she had landed in a helicopter in Bosnia, 1976, and she was under fire. Footage eventually found she was not under fire at all. There was no fire. She landed, and there were smiling local officials and children who greeted her there, and she had to admit that that was a lie. So my point is that in both of these cases, it's not unusual for presidents to attack the press, and it's not unusual for them to lie big time. I am often asked by people, when you get lied to like that, how do you feel? Or when you get attacked, how do you feel? And it may surprise you, I feel nothing. It means absolutely nothing. And here's two reasons why. One is, if you have devoted your life as a journalist every day to trying to pursue the truth, and every single day people either shade the truth or lie to you outright, you will become cynical and skeptical beyond belief. And it's you. After a while, you just realize it's part of the job. It's just what happens. It's not good. It's not pleasant. It's not right. It's just part of journalism and human nature. The other part of that is what happens when you get attacked. Does anyone shrink back? You don't shrink back at all. It amuses me. A couple conventions ago, I was there, and it was a Republican convention, and I was in the press area, and behind us was this group of Republicans who were chanting anti-press statements. And if you could have taken a video of this, you would have seen these people screaming as loud as they could. There's terrible things about the press. And maybe 100 reporters just typing on their computers like this, talking. It goes over your head. It's nothing. And I was thinking about this recently because a guy I know, Jack Schaefer, who's a very good media critic for Politico, he wrote a column about this. And he talked about what happens when people try to shame you as a journalist. And he said, tell a reporter shame on you and see what happens. Even if he should be ashamed of himself, he'll merely blush and restart the interview. We're shameless that way, like door-to-door salesmen, inured to insults and only encouraged by a door slammed in a face. And I think that's how quality journalists work, all right? So what is different about this president? Okay. There are a couple things that I think are significant. One has to do with fabrications. I've already said presidents lie. People in public life, they always lie. They all lie. Many are honest, but they all have a history of lying, all right? This president, most previous presidents have lied about things or fabricated things that have plausible deniability. You could make the assertion, but it would be very hard to prove otherwise. What strikes me different about this climate is that Donald Trump says things that are so easily disproved, that have no evidence. So if he says, I would have won the popular vote except for those 3 million people that engaged in voter fraud, there is no evidence of that so far. Or his claim that thousands of people were bused from New Hampshire or from Massachusetts to New Hampshire to vote against him, there is absolutely no evidence of that. His claim that thousands of people were cheering in that, as he called it, that Arabic city, Jersey City, in 9/11 when the Twin Towers came down. People have investigated that with ample footage. There is no evidence of thousands of people doing that. His claim that Ted Cruz's father was somehow involved with Lee Harvey Oswald in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There's no evidence of that. The birther thing I find just remarkable. That's one of the more remarkable ones to me because basically, to believe that Barack Obama, that there was a conspiracy to make him president, even though he was born outside the country in Kenya, which is not true, you would have to believe that when he was born in Kenya, that they looked down on little Barack and said, I think you may one day be the leader of the free world. But we've got this problem. There's this law in America that says you have to be born here. So what we have to do is we have to come up with a fake birth notice. Now, where shall we put that in a newspaper? Let me see, Columbus, Des Moines, Honolulu. Let's do Honolulu. And then you'd have to get somebody to fabricate an actual birth certificate. So my point is, when you make statements like that are so demonstrably not true and double down on them, there's something different about the leader in that case. And I would put in that category the more recent one on the alleged wiretapping of Trump Tower. There is no evidence, according to what the head of the FBI and others have said. So that is one big difference in Donald Trump. And there's a big debate in the media right now. There's a shift. I was talking about this last night in our ethics class, that during the last campaign, many news organizations, for the first time, major ones like the Times and the Post, started saying in headlines, Trump falsely asserts that. You would have never seen that 4 years ago. But the assertions are so demonstrably unproven that they are willing to go that far. Now, there's an additional debate going on as to whether or not you should call him a liar. And I happen to not be in the camp that believes that, because I think to call someone a liar, in my book, you have to have assumed that they actually knowingly are stating a falsehood. And in Donald Trump's case, even though they are falsehoods, I'm not sure that he knowingly is doing that. I think there's a pattern of him seeing something someplace and thinking, it fits my purposes, I'm putting it out there as truth. That may not be a lie, but there's a whole psychological thing that we're not going to get into. That's where you have to get into science cafe conversations. I wouldn't know anything about that, all right? The second thing that's different about him is his attacks on the press are, on a large scale, very personal, and they are sustained. So think about Megyn Kelly. I mean, there was almost a creepy stalker type thing going on there, that how relentless he was on that. And the other one that really sticks with me, and you know, everyone I talk to about this, they remember this. It was the mocking of the disabled reporter, Serge Kovaleski, who, for those of you who don't know him, this is a very solid reporter who has worked for the Washington Post and the New York Times. He has a disability where it's very painful for him to move his joints. So you've seen the video of Trump mocking him like this. What struck me as interesting about that was that when Trump got criticized for mocking someone with a disability, his reaction was, I wasn't doing that. How could I? I don't even know this guy. He doesn't even register with me. Well, it was quickly shown that Serge Kovaleski has interviewed him over a dozen times, including one-on-one interviews in his office. And I would argue that even for someone who has lots of press interviews that they do, if someone came in with a disability that is that extreme, it probably would have left a mark. You would have thought about it. And these attacks, what strikes me as interesting and different is that he often doubles down on them. And they have consequences, and this is where it gets a little bit dicey. It is not widely known that in the last presidential election, major news organizations took their political reporters and put them through what we call hostile environment training. Hostile environment training typically is reserved for journalists who are going overseas into war zones, and they need to be able to anticipate crowd movements or when things are getting dicey, all that. There was enough concern by NPR, AP, New York Times, Washington Post, that the taunting of journalists by Trump in public settings could cause one of two things to happen. Either there's going to be a mass attack on the press, which is typically penned up like animals in a press area, you know. Or the other thing that might happen is that people feel emboldened when he calls them an enemy of the people to think, I've got to take him out. I have to individually take him out. So there are numerous cases where news organizations have had to hire private security guards to accompany reporters. In a case of the AP, they actually took a reporter off the beat because they thought the death threats were credible enough. Megyn Kelly had to hire private security when she went to Disney World with her kids, fearing that she might be attacked or they might be attacked because of all this. So those are things that are different than past presidents. And then just a small one that I just find a rich irony, that you have a president who is so fast and loose with the facts this way, who is making a campaign of accusing the media of creating fake news. That is an irony that I think is just really kind of rich. So those are things that are different involving Trump. But I think there are two other things that are different that don't involve Trump at all, but they are just the way media has changed. So for these old people, my people over here, all right, we grew up with three TV networks and a handful of national newspapers, and then some dominant regional papers, all right? All that has changed. In the digital age, you don't have that news ecosystem that is restricted and sort of a limited number of gatekeepers. What you have now, and this is a good thing in our society, is that people can get their news from 100 different places. And it's a great thing in our society that you don't have to have a printing press or a broadcast tower to be a journalist. If you have some product to put out that you think is credible, you can call yourself a journalist, you can call yourself a news organization, and I personally think that is wonderful about what's going on. But it does change the dynamic. And the way it changes the dynamic is that accompany this rise of just more media is the rise of ideological news sites. Now, before you say, like some people, this is a new thing and it's bad, let's just go back in history. In the 19th century, that's how most media was. Most newspapers were connected with political parties. So the notion of me, you know, Mr. Play it down the middle, don't give your opinions, that's kind of a 20th century construct. So we're coming back, it's not entirely new, but the digital age changes it all. And Roger Ailes changed it a little bit too, but he's very successful in doing this. But what it means is that when you have a president who has a following and the nation is split and it's ideologically at odds, that he is capable of saying things that in normal times we would reject as crazy or unproven, but he's likely to get a large following that says, no, that's true. So what you have is, I mean, the silly equivalent would be a president who says, tweets, actually, I've just discovered the sun comes up in the west and it sets in the east, okay? Demonstrably untrue, but you can imagine a number of websites who support him saying, you know, this is interesting, we ought to be studying that. He may be onto something here, you know, he really, so that is a different thing, and it doesn't have anything to do with Trump. He just sort of exploits that. The second thing that's going along with that is the low standing of the media in modern history. It's never been lower, at least in my lifetime, and I'm 68, all right? When you analyze that, you have to be a little careful, because all institutions have been diminished in stature, not just the United States. There's ample evidence this is happening around the world. And you also have to be a little careful when you do these studies that when you ask people, what do you think is your credibility level in media? If you ask them that question, it's very low. If you ask the question, what is your trust in the media that you most rely on for your news, it tends to go way up. But aside from that gets into the ideological press, but aside from that, it is very, very low. And when it's low, it gives him more of an opportunity to sort of exploit this thing, that the press is out of control. And I think there's also confusion in many people's minds about what is the press. And frankly, I struggle with that. So if you watch MSNBC and you have Pete Williams come on at 4 o'clock and do this detailed report about the Supreme Court hearing, and the next thing you have is Reverend Al spouting whatever he does, you know, or you could say the same thing about Fox News. It's, I think for people who are not sophisticated about the media, it's confusing. Who is a journalist and what is this outlet? Are they straight news or whatever? So, you know, in newspapers, it's pretty clear. We have the news pages and then the editorial page, which is the institutional opinion. It's less clear on TV, and of course so many people get their news that way. If you think it's not real, this diminished trust in the media, Gallup in 1976 asked the question about trust in media, and they had a number of categories. Two categories were, do you have a great deal of trust in the media, or do you have a fair amount? Those two combined, 76% of the people that they surveyed said they had either a fair amount or a great deal of trust in the media. Now, keep in mind, this was after Watergate, and newspapers basically brought down the president for their reporting. After Vietnam, where news organizations, I think, really unmasked what was going on there. So the press is riding really high. Okay, 76%. 2015, they did the same survey, 40%. It's a huge drop. 2016, down to 32%. 2 weeks ago, Emerson College did a survey that many people think was pretty reliable. Registered voters, 49% of registered voters said they believe Donald Trump more than the media. So this is an issue. It's an issue for the media, and it's also an opportunity for someone like Donald Trump to exploit this weakness in standing of the media. So this all combines to sort of create a climate in which the future of truth is very much in the balance. And it's an important time. I mean, this is an important benchmark where we're going. So, sort of winding this up, I was thinking about what advice I would give people in how to deal with this. So let's just sort of unpack it for different groups here. If you are a faculty member, I have the following advice. First is, you have an obligation, regardless of what college you teach in here, to instill in students a very firm understanding of independent press, of First Amendment, not just freedom of the press, but the four other freedoms of assembly, religion, right to petition your government, of speech. There are surveys that are shocking, or have been shocking over the years, how little people embrace that. But that is fundamental to any understanding of the importance of truth and a free and independent media. Second, I think it's important to teach students about what the founders intended. And if you go back and read the Federalist Papers and just read any number of things on this, you quickly, I think, will come to a conclusion I have, that it's a brilliant concept, but they were not just saying you have the right to ask critical questions of your government. What they were really saying is you have an implied obligation. That is why we are giving you this right. You were supposed to hold these people to account. People in power don't like it. And you know, the truth is, when people in media get questioned, hey, I was an ombudsman, that was my job, they do not like it. They get very, very angry. But we know that what gets measured gets fixed. What gets scrutinized gets better. That's the purpose of this. Third, I think for faculty members, news literacy is an increasingly important thing at all levels of education levels, but in college. I'm not, like many of you, I'm not a full-time academic. I came to this late, but I am stunned at the number of times that I will ask a student, where'd you get that? And they say, well, I saw it on the internet, all right? And, well, where? I mean, where did it come from? What is the sense of verification that it is actually true? Have you sought an alternative view? Have you reconciled those views? That is critically important to understanding, I would argue, a free press. Those are some of the things faculty can do. If you are a student, I would double down on this and say, get an understanding of the First Amendment. 2 weeks ago, there was a very interesting Knight Foundation survey that was done that had a finding that 90% of college students who were surveyed said that a free press is more important to democracy than 20 years ago. So I read that and I thought, this is great, all right? This is the movement, we want it going that way. Read a little bit deeper, and here's what found of those same people surveyed. 69% said colleges should have policies forbidding slurs or, quote, intentionally offensive language. Who defines offensive language, all right? For anyone who thinks that that is a good thing for universities to do this, to have policies forbidding this, I would say go back to 1919, read that famous Wendell Holmes Supreme Court ruling where he talked about freedom for the speech we hate. It's a brilliantly written opinion. What he's basically saying, we need the freedom to have people say stupid, crazy, racist, sexist things, and that the remedy for noxious speech is speech that is more prevalent, that is smarter, more persuasive, and it does weigh out. It's remarkable in our system that when you have free, open debate, that you can do that. So I worry whenever people think that it's a good idea to restrict speech. You may restrict someone else's speech today. It may be yours tomorrow. So you have to be a little bit careful of that. Many students also tell me, this is a lesson for students, I ask them always about their news consumption habits, and it's surprising the number of students that say, if it's important, it will come to me. And what I tell them is, it's laziness. That's laziness. You have to be more intellectually inquisitive in today's world to go out and explore things, not just wait for important things to come to you. Because when they come to you at that level, they may have already been decided and you won't have any say in them. If you were a journalist, it's the final category, I have some advice. One would be, in the words of Washington Post editor Marty Barron, do your job. Just 3 words. My wife is by training an attorney, and we used to have these discussions. Her job was to put the best face on a scumbag. It's a little harsh, but all right. My job is to seek the truth as close as I can get to it, all right? I feel really clean at the end of the day when I've done that. And I think that when journalism is done well, it's a beautiful thing. So it's as simple as doing your job. But I would say with doing your job in this environment, do it better than you've ever done it, be fairer, be more accurate, be more aggressive. And that leads to the second thing, my recommendation for journalists. Don't take the bait when Trump starts attacking you. Just do your job. Because often when he's throwing this stuff out, he's hoping that the media is going to get all hot and bothered about it. There are times you should be, but most of the time we should not be. Just do our job. Dig in, hold people in power to account. The third thing I would say is, to journalists, we need to have a better understanding of what's going on the inside of America. We had a major fail in the last election. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but in my opinion, one of the reasons we did is that there has been a hollowing out of journalism in the middle of America, and there is an echo chamber where people on the margins, the borders, are talking to each other, and we're not paying enough attention to what was going on inside. We were not capturing the depth of frustration, fear, anger, whatever. And we missed the election a lot. And I would fault polling for this. And in many ways, pollsters did a good job. If you look really internally in some of these, they were capturing some of the trends at the end. My beef isn't with the method, with the results. It was what we should have been trying to find out. What is motivating this? As an ombudsman for the Post, this goes back about 6 years ago, there was a major Tea Party rally in Washington, and I wrote a column criticizing the Washington Post for basically not giving it enough coverage. I actually had people from the newsroom come down to my office and say, you don't understand, these people are crazy, all right? And my response to them was, they may be, that's your view, but there's something happening in America that you have not understood. And that's our job. Our job is to reflect what is actually going on. And I just think we haven't done a good enough job. The final advice I would have for journalists would be maximize transparency. We do a terrible job of explaining to the public how we gather news, why we gather news, why we make decisions. And it has consequences. There's distrust. If people knew more about the care that legitimate news organizations took in actually gathering and processing the news, they would know. Again, when I was at the Washington Post, a typical call I would get would somebody call up and say, I'm really angry about this story today, and you guys don't have any ethics, and you did this, and you just don't care about accurate reporting. And what I would say to them is, okay, well, let me check into it. Let me check the ethics policy of the Post, see what it says about this, and I'll get back to you. 99% of the time, their response would be, you have an ethics policy? The Post has an ethics policy? Okay, so what's that telling us? They think people tell us things, and it goes out there. We just put it out there because we've got a vehicle to do it. That is not the way it works, but we don't tell that story very well. There are news organizations where it is that loose. And that's a way for my people, mainstream media, to distinguish themselves. Okay, is anything good coming out of this? Yep, one thing that's good. Every time Trump criticizes news organizations, circulation goes up and they get more revenue, all right? That's good. This is happening with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vanity Fair, whatever. I've often thought if I was the editor of the Sioux Falls paper, I'd be begging Trump to come there and criticize us, It'll be good for us. That's not to say all the problems are being solved, because those are major news organizations. If you're the Columbus Dispatch, Cincinnati Enquirer, whatever, those people have real financial challenges. And as I often say in speeches, and as I've said to classes any number of times, we don't have a journalism problem in the world. We've got more journalism, good and bad, than we ever have. We have a revenue model problem. We have to figure out ways to pay for journalism. And journalism is expensive. I don't know the current figures of the New York Times budget for the newsroom, but it's probably $300 million. That's a lot of money to cover news aggressively. So that is a help from Trump in an odd way. I'm a senior advisor to a group in New York called the Committee to Protect Journalists, a marvelous group that historically has tried to protect journalists around the world in despotic regimes that get thrown in jail. And I'm also the chair of their development committee. Going into last year, we had set a fundraising goal of $5 million. When Trump was elected, we ended the year at $8.4 million. We have so much money rolling in now, we've had to hire extra staff to process it. That is a sad but good thing that is happening right now, and Meryl Streep gave us a shout out at the Golden Globe, so we got even more money. So that's the good stuff. But basically, most of what's happening is bad. And so to conclude here, let's just recap what's going on right now. We have a president who's attempting to delegitimize journalism to suit his interests. Okay, that's entirely his right. The threat to a free press and an independent journalism in the United States is as great now as it has been in my lifetime. He's using the presidency to show preference for sites that are opinion sites, to the exclusion of sites or news organizations that traffic in actual facts. There's ample evidence of showing preference that way. He wants the press to be compliant. Every leader does. When they're not compliant, there is a price to pay. He's vindictive that way. Again, that's not entirely unusual with presidents. And in my view, he has a very, very limited, tenuous grasp of the concept of free press. You would like to think charitably that he's doing this with an understanding of what free press is about. I'm not sure he does, in my opinion. Okay, the consequences of this, how it could really go bad. It's important to keep in mind that so far what we have is a war of words going on there. But it could turn bad very quickly. Here are some of the ways it could turn bad. He's obsessed with leaks, even though he's one of the great leakers of all time. But it would be easy to imagine that he orders his Justice Department to start prosecuting reporters who are in possession of classified information. It is conceivable to me, if he gets his back to the wall, that he would start ordering surveillance of reporters, not just to find out what they're doing, but to find out who their sources in government are that are leaking information. It's conceivable to me that he could challenge broadcast licenses. It's conceivable to me that he would show preference throughout the entire federal government to spokespeople only talking with people who basically are compliant and support his point of view to the exclusion of independent, neutral news organizations. All of these things can happen. And one thing, just to close here before taking your questions, if you think it's not having consequences, I will tell you that already it has had severe consequences around the world. The Committee to Protect Journalists, whenever we used to go out to a lot of these authoritarian regimes to try and get somebody out of jail or to shed light on people being harassed by the government, journalists being harassed, we always sort of had the moral high ground. We had the moral free press, the idyllic free press of the United States to point to and say to these leaders, this is the standard. When you have a president that is adopting the language of Stalin, enemies of the people, calling journalists that, or sounding like the late Hugo Chavez, or pitching in with Putin, who there's ample evidence has ordered the execution of journalists, or Erdogan in Turkey, where I've actually met with the president of Turkey. This is a hard-ass guy who does not even believe in the internet, has shut down Twitter when it gets critical, all that. He's basically emboldening them. And there was one thing, I'll close with this, one thing that I thought was just sort of very telling, very sad in the last couple of weeks. Over the last 15 or 20 years, the American press has been very good about supporting Mexican journalists who went through a bad period with their government, where they were harassed. There were different ways they used to bankrupt news organizations. They were, in many cases, editors, reporters were executed by cartels. We stood with them, and we gave them support. There was an open letter signed by hundreds of journalists, publishers, recently on March 6th. I'll just read you the key phrase, and it was sent to American journalists. It said, this is from Mexican journalists. It says, "You have stood with us during the darkest hours of press freedom in Mexico, and although we never could believe this day would come, we now stand with you." That's rather chilling, I think. So with that, I will be stopping, and I would be happy to answer whatever questions you have. Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought that today, I know that it's, at least in my view, kind of easy to look at a certain news outlet or media outlet and immediately identify if it's left-leaning or right-leaning. And a lot of people kind of just stick to if they're liberal, they only read liberal media and so on and so forth. Do you think that's gotten more polarized today than it was in the past?
Yeah, I do, and I don't think it. Oh, the question is, with websites today that are ideological, has it caused more polarization? News organizations. Is your question, has it caused the nation to become more polarized, or are there more polarizing news sites? Okay. Well, I think the answer is yes, but I think we have to be careful with that. It's not necessarily bad that we have more voices, It's an obligation on the part of the news consumer to make decisions about credibility. I mean, I'm fascinated. I've told an ethics class this story once. I had a friend who was editor of a small paper in Redding, California. I was talking to him once on a conference call about a year ago, and there are other journalists there, and he said, "Have any of you been visited by the contrail people?" Does anyone know what the contrails are? These are people who believe that the government is putting mind-altering agents in jet fuel, and that when you see these vapor trails, that they come over your community, that actually the government is doing this so this stuff floats down and it warps your mind, and it's a way of controlling you. And we were all laughing on the phone. We thought this was ridiculous. And we were asking him, well, where do people get this information? He said, well, there's a site called InfoWars, which you've probably heard of. That's an ideological site. And we said, well, how many people visit you? And he said, well, we covered a public hearing with our county commission recently. 1,000 people showed up. And I went and read the website. These people were testifying, saying, there were people actually saying, it's got to be happening because there are fewer bugs on the trees than there were 10 years ago. I'm thinking, what? Okay, so to your point, InfoWars, people like that, they are ideologically out there, and they are going to have an audience, all right? I don't think you want to restrict them, but the remedy is for citizens to know enough that they are looking at other sites, and there are ample ones that knock this down right and left. So it's a tricky thing. You never want to restrict speech. But yeah, are we becoming more polarized? Sure. Yeah.
Not that I don't agree with you on the point where you made of the 69% of students, college students, that said that we should kind of have a limit on hate speech. And you said that opens up a debate for intellectual people to come and talk. Do you believe that worked with the results of the last election, though?
In what sense?
In the sense that Donald Trump was more than excited to speak hate speech and say uncredible, mean things, and in the end did end up winning the presidential debate. So did that open up? Do you think that actually did open up an intellectual conversation, or do you think that
I think it tapped into something that, I'm sorry. The question was, Donald Trump in the last election was spewing hate speech. That would be your interpretation. I wouldn't totally disagree with, I would not totally disagree with that. I think he was edging that way. But did that open up an intellectual conversation, I think is what you were saying. And I would take it a different way. I would say, maybe, I don't know the answer to that, but it tapped into a feeling that was out there that we as the press should have been reporting more deeply on as to why people were then saying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Makes perfect sense to forbid all Muslims to come in our country, even though when you think about it, this is what we were built on, right? So again, I would say it's a very dicey thing to try to restrict speech. You are entirely within your rights, anyone is, if Donald Trump says stuff that you disagree with, to stand up or to use whatever means you can that's legal to say, that's crazy, here's the proper speech. Remedy for noxious speech is better speech, more persuasive speech. The minute you start restricting it, in my opinion, that's a difficult line to draw. Yeah. Yes?
If the presidential briefings become restricted to certain organizations, do you think that other organizations should refuse to attend?
So the question is, these daily briefings, if Sean Spicer does what he's done once or twice to forbid legacy media organizations from attending and then prefer Breitbart News and all that, should the others boycott it? I don't know the proper vehicle, but I would say we need to stand together more on that. And there are methods to get around that, all right? Now, the problem with what Spicer did was it wasn't the daily briefing, it was something called the gaggle. So it takes place, it's like an informal off-camera thing where a smaller group of reporters, usually influential reporters, can talk more freely back and forth, but it does form the basis for coverage. When you get restricted from that, that is a problem, because the only people who have the information tend to be ideological websites and you can't get it. So let's put that aside for a second. I think in that case, there may be some merit in pushing back in a big way. The briefing itself, this is a big topic, but there's usually a transcript of that, all right? So by not being invited to that, you're basically losing your opportunity to ask a question. It's not like you're not getting information, it's just your question doesn't get asked. But this opens the door to a broader issue. And I could speak for 8 hours on this, and I won't, but it's a big issue with me. There is a culture of anonymity in Washington that the press has allowed to happen. And we have gotten it to the point where you can trot out the Director of National Security in a briefing, and the restrictions are they have to be identified as a senior administration official, all right? I do not agree with that. And the reason they do that is because they have somebody come out and brief the press, but there's a later event with the president, and they don't want to step on that message. They want the president to be out there. Well, we are not their PR agents, all right? We are there to cover the news. And so in cases like that, I think we have to be clever about doing it. There was a suggestion years ago by that columnist Jack Schaefer when reporters wouldn't walk out en masse. He said, look, if they do a senior administration briefing, you agree to it. But what I want you to do is when you get out of there, you call me. I will immediately write a blog item saying the real briefer was the Secretary of State, so that when you do your story, you can say a senior administration official, but columnist Jack Schaefer said it was actually Secretary of State. So that's one way to get around it. The other one, very briefly, the funniest story I ever heard was years ago. I forget the specifics of this, but I'll make it up a little bit, but it involved legendary Ben Bradley. He had a Post reporter that came back from a briefing, I think it was with the FAA, and the top official had briefed saying, you can't use my name. You know, you can only say a senior official of the FAA. So Bradley was steamed about this, but he said, okay, here's the way we're going to get around it. They honored that, but then they put the guy's picture in the paper that said senior FAA official who declines to be identified. And I thought, yeah, that's how you do it. Right. So anyhow, it's a big issue. Yes. I'll get to you.
I fully understand your reluctance and the media's reluctance to use the word lie when it comes to politics. It seems that there's
Okay, so the question is, how much longer can you go without calling it a lie? Just watch how things might start to turn, and pay attention to one thing that happened last night. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, which, by the way, if you're a liberal, you should read that page. You'll disagree with it, but it's very well thought out, and everybody who's a conservative reads it. They've never been big fans of Trump, but they basically are in his camp compared to anything else. They had an editorial that was posted last night that basically said, you are destroying your presidency by these harebrained assertions. I think when they start saying that, and other people start saying it, and then you have the buildup of, layer that on the FBI director saying there's absolutely no evidence and we've just wasted a lot of government time and resources to prove that there was no wiretapping at Trump Tower, I think it could start to turn. So I think it may happen organically on its own. I don't know that, but it might. Let me just get him and then I'll get you. Yeah.
So during the election, Trump discredited mainstream media such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and a lot of his supporters believed him that anything they publish is not true, fake news and all that. And I kind of fear that that's an endless cycle that he gets his supporters on. Going forward, how can organizations like the Times and the Washington Post regain credibility among Trump supporters who bought into that?
Okay, so the question is, Trump has attacked specifically mainstream media, Times, the Post, all that. How can they regain that credibility even among Trump supporters, all right? Yeah. Specifically among Trump supporters. I would say you may never, There have been studies that show that people who, average Trump supporters who attack the media, and specifically the Times and the Post, never read the Times and the Post, all right? And I'm sure that would be true of liberals who are, apoplectic about the Wall Street Journal editorial page or something like that. I would go back to, you can't please everybody, but as a journalist, in my book, have one standard, truth, and the same standards of fairness and accuracy, and drive toward it relentlessly. And double down. I mean, when Jack Schaefer was right, good reporters, when somebody says, don't look in that room, they're going to do everything to get in that room, And that's what we do. The most frustrating thing to me about this is that, and this goes back to the transparency part, it's hard for people to know. It's like people say, what makes you a journalist, And I can't really defend it, because what I would have to say is what I truly believe. I'm not smarter than anyone else, but I've spent a lifetime learning how to gather and process news and present it in a way that I think is understandable. Not everyone can do that. I can't do science. I can't do math and all that. I can do this just because I've been doing it. And I'm proud of doing that, but I don't think it's easy to tell that story. Nurse is sort of agreeing with me. I think it's not an easy thing. So I'm sorry. Yes.
I have noticed in reading major publications recently that they are being more explicit in pointing out falsehoods that Trump has said.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I recall during prior to the election, when I would read a story in a major newspaper about a speech Trump had given, one of his campaign speeches, and he had made a clearly false statement. The newspaper headline would read, Trump said blah, blah. Whereas now they're tending to say, Trump falsely said blah.
Mm-hmm.
If the media had pointed that out earlier, would that have changed the election? If they had challenged his false statements?
Yeah, good question. So
Reported them verbatim?
So the question is, if earlier in the campaign, if the media en masse had basically said he's making false statements, would that have changed it? I think not. I think not. And this is where the big debate about whether the media is responsible for Donald Trump. I find all sorts of deficiencies in our coverage. One of them I just mentioned. I think I blame TV and early TV for sticking with his rallies for an hour just because it was like waiting for a car crash and you knew it was going to be interesting, or letting them phone in to morning TV shows when everybody else had to actually go to the studio. I really fault them for that. But the reality, in my opinion, is he won because he had something that more people wanted than Hillary Clinton had. He had something, whether it was he was channeling people's frustration or his willingness to shout and be crude. It's not our job to say whether that's right or wrong. We can have opinions, but that's what happened in the election. He had something that was different. And also there was the anomaly of the Republican field. I mean, he was running against 16 other people early on, and it was easy to stand out. If it had just started out as a two-person race between him and Cruz, I don't know, might be different. So I don't think so. But I do acknowledge we were slow to get to that point, though.
Last question.
Yes?
I'm curious then, based on so many of the questions that, when you speak about the part of the fertile ground also that you see, that you tapped into something that is going on here, okay? You also expressed that all presidents lie, okay, and have lied, whatever. So there's universal things, which I feel carry out globally also. Leaders lie throughout the world, there's corruption, on and on and on. So because of your career, can you say anything about, from an international perspective, what you think? I mean, you talked about the Mexican journalists standing with you, but, I mean, even the thing of, I'm reading some editorials that come from Asia that are saying, we choose people in our government who have proper backgrounds to guide us on environmental things or something, which I feel is almost a deliberate, between the lines comment to what's going on here. So I'm curious if you feel universal is a fertile ground that will support this kind of talk, or is already reacting and responding to it?
Well, the question is, it's a big question. Universally, are people supporting what Trump represents, or is there a counter movement saying we rejected it? Am I sort of captured it?
Yes.
I think both is going on. So if you look in Europe, I mean, there's a battle in many European countries, France, whatever, over how far right we should go. This is not unusual. A separate question, however, is if any government says we always pick people who know what they're doing, I would say that's probably wrong. I mean, yeah, but it's. I think there is a backlash. I mean, there's alarm around the world about this. I mean, all you have to do is read probably Asian press, and there is concern about what his statements mean if there is a precipitating event on the Korean Peninsula. And I think in the back of people's minds is he has a history of snap judgment, and in a case like that, when you're dealing with nuclear weapons and people that are right on each other's borders, boy, you better be right. I should also end here by saying, I made fun of presidents for lying. Most professions lie, okay? Corporate chieftains lie, academics lie. I mean, it's, but I kind of think when you're presidential material, we hope that you have a little higher standing. That's not to say there haven't been some good presidents who have done wonderful things, but there's a long history of lying, all right? So, that it?
At this point, let's thank Andy for being here, and I would encourage everybody to go up and ask questions if you have.
Thank you.